Thanks everyone for joining this next webinar in our Climate24 election impact series. While people are still joining, we'll wait a few minutes to start. But in the meantime, if anyone has questions they'd like us to cover in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar, feel free to put them in the Q&A function now or at any point throughout our discussion. We'll give folks a few more minutes to join, but looking forward to having you participate in our next webinar here on focusing on the Farm Bill. If you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A function and we'll get to them later on in our discussion. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Emily Domenech and I am a Senior Vice President here at Boundary Stone Partners. Boundary Stone is the leading climate change advisory and government affairs firm. We work at the intersection of technology, policy, and finance on clean energy and climate tech. And today we're going to be talking about the Farm Bill and the related federal programs and how they'll be affected by that upcoming 2024 election. At BSP, we're working with experts within our field and within our team and out in the field to sort of take on these pressing political priorities. And we're excited to have another episode in our webinar series on Climate24. So today we're joined by two experts from our broader network who we're so grateful to have with us today, Stacy McBride and Jonathan Cordone. Stacy is currently serving as the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs at Blackwell Strategies and was previously the Chief of Staff for Senator Roy Blunt and the Staff Director for the Senate Republican Policy Committee. Jonathan is currently the principal and founder at Cordone Consulting and was previously Deputy Undersecretary for Agriculture for Farm and Foreign Agriculture Services, as well as the Chief Counsel for the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. Hi, Jonathan and Stacy. Thank you so much for joining us today. So before we dive into our discussion, I wanted to kind of walk us through a little bit of a state of play for the Farm Bill, as well as the relevant funding we're tracking in this space from the IRA. As a quick reminder, if you have questions for our speaker throughout our discussion, please go ahead and submit those through the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can at the end of our discussion today. So looking at the state of play for the Farm Bill, we're currently operating under a year-long extension, which is extending the 2018 Agriculture Improvement Act. That bill expired last fall, and we have an extension that's through September of this year that was enacted as part of the CR back in November of 2023. While that extension gets us through September, we've seen quite a bit of activity this year from both the House and Senate Agriculture Committees to move that Farm Bill reauthorization forward. For example, we saw a framework text released by the House and the Senate in May. The House of Representatives went ahead and moved forward with a markup of their Farm Bill in mid-May. And then in June, we saw the Senate Republicans release a corresponding framework that responded to some of what Senator Stabenow put out earlier in May. As we work towards the expiring extension, I think we can expect to see the Ag Committees continue that activity and hopefully move into a slightly more formal negotiating process so that we can actually have a bill that can move not just through the House and the Senate, but to be actually enacted, hopefully in the lame duck session. I think that's when we would expect to see some activity. So that sort of tells you that the election in November can have a lot of influence on the direction that we see this negotiation go, and the direction that we'll see these bills end up. Some of the major issues that we have on the table are stalwarts in the Farm Bill discussion. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, is always an area where we have some disagreements between Republicans and Democrats. We've seen California's Prop 12 become an issue, how we manage the CCC. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're really going to focus in on the conservation and climate programs, particularly the funding that was provided under the IRA. As a reminder, the IRA provided $19.5 billion for climate smart agriculture and forestry programs outside of the traditional Farm Bill baseline. That includes funding for programs like EQIP and our regional partnerships and conservation stewardship programs, and a number of other relevant grant programs that are have been utilized in the past under the Farm Bill baseline. Of note, $16.7 billion of the allotted IRA funding remains. And it's important to think through the fact that the fate of that funding in the next Farm Bill is really one of those significant areas of disagreement between Republicans and Democrats, and potentially looking forward to the elections in 2024 that could really shape the future of those programs. So I want to kick it over to our panelists here and sort of start off our discussion. We've got our lay of the land. We've seen the House Agriculture Committee report bills out of committee with some bipartisan support. And in the Senate, we see these competing frameworks from Republicans and Democrats. For the panelists, what do you see as the path forward for these products for the rest of the 118th Congress? And I'll kick it to Stacy first to give her take.
Right. So first, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I really like talking about these topics, especially with my friend Jonathan. So I looked at the calendar a little bit earlier this month, and there are only about 6 weeks left. The House and Senate are here before September 30th, when the current framework expires for the Farm Bill. I think that what you are seeing is two completely divergent approaches from Chairwoman Stabenow's framework that she released in May to sort of like counter what Chairman Thompson also released in May and then ultimately marked up in May. And, you know, CBO is not our friend in these negotiations. And I think that we are seeing that the CBO mark and the CBO score is vastly different from what I think Chairman Thompson thought he would get as far as savings from the CCC. And I think that is going to make the road to getting this done very difficult. I don't think CBO's recent report on the federal debt and how much we owe is going to give any of our more conservative members any, I guess, ability to say, look, we should spend billions of dollars on these programs. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of belt tightening, and I think that is ultimately going to impact how the next Farm Bill looks. So obviously, I don't feel like there's a framework for getting this done by September 30th. I think past the election, you have an opportunity, but it's a very narrow window before you really have to kick it into next year.
Jonathan, let's hear your take.
I think you're going to hear me say a number of times that I agree completely with Stacy. It's just going to be the way this conversation goes. The The reality is that it is, I think, next to impossible for this farm bill to move before the election when you consider where both sides are currently in the process. I will say, I believe personally very strongly that both Chairwoman Stabenow and Chairman Thompson would love to get a bill done this year. You know, you've got very narrow margins in the House and in the Senate, which makes it next to impossible to move a partisan bill through either chamber. Chairman Thompson was able to report a bipartisan bill out of committee with every Republican and 4 Democrats. But when you look at the math on the House floor, he will lose Republicans on the House floor and need to find more Democrats. So that's a real challenge going forward. A lot of the reality of the Farm Bill right now is dealing with the math of where the votes are going to be. In the lame duck session, I think that there is a very real possibility that this gets done. It depends on a couple of things. Number one, how does the election turn out? And my crystal ball has been broken for over a year now, so I can't even give you any guesses as to what I think is going to happen there. But if the key leaders in the agriculture committees and in the House and the Senate think that they are going to get a better product for the next 5 years under the current situation than whatever the election is bringing in January, that's going to be a real motivating factor for everybody. The last thing I'll say on that front is Stacy was, again, completely right. The issue boils down to money. It's votes and money. And you know, the reality is that there just is not enough money to pay for the bill that Chairman Thompson has put forward so far. And you know, I think the agriculture community would like Senator Stabenow's bill to be a little more robust and ambitious than it currently is when it comes to the funding levels. I have seen stranger things happen where you can find pay-fors that you didn't think existed when you needed to, but that's really going to involve bipartisan cooperation and the active involvement of the leadership in both the House and the Senate, meaning Jeffries, McConnell, Johnson, and Schumer.
So I'm glad you mentioned the vote count coming out of the House markup. You know, as we talked about in our lay of the land, the House is sort of a little ahead of the Senate in terms of that procedural action. They've gone through their markup. They got a bill through committee with those 4 Democrats voting. Do you think that did that markup resolve in a way that you think leads to bipartisan floor consideration? Or do you think we're in a position where this is something that's going to have to get negotiated behind closed doors? I'll kick it to you first, Jonathan, this time.
I'm going to say behind closed doors. What I thought was an interesting tell is there were 4 Democrats that voted for the bill, but all 4 of them also signed on to the minority's dissenting views, which is, for those who are not familiar, with every significant bill that moves through committee, you have a committee report, and then the minority is allowed to provide a different perspective on what they think the bill should be. And the 3 big issues I believe flagged in that dissenting views were the CCC discretion, the Thrifty Food Program, the SNAP discretion issue, and then a third one that came up late in the markup, quite frankly, but does seem to have taken some hold, is this idea of not allowing USDA to contract with any supplier or processor that has any implication of child labor involved in their scenario. So in some ways, I think those 4 Democrats who are from strong agricultural districts needed to say they wanted the process to move forward, but still have concerns about what stays in the bill. So I'm not sure their votes even are guaranteed on the floor if the bill stays the same.
I will follow on that, and I will not pretend to be a House expert since I spent my entire career in the Senate. So Emily may have to help me out a little bit here, but you know, up until they really started moving some of these appropriations bills, we haven't seen the House Rules Committee work in a way that is completely functional. And I think a bill of this size, with as many places as you can go for amendments, may make that difficult. You know, it's traditionally Democrats vote against the rule if Republicans are in the majority. And so you're going to have to get all of those Republicans on the House Rules Committee to agree to that process on the floor, essentially, to put the bill out there. I think that could be a pretty difficult challenge. You know, they can do a lot in the Rules Committee, insist upon cuts to programs and a lot of other things. So I think the path to the floor is pretty difficult. But I've been wrong before, and my crystal ball has been a little hazy these past couple of months anyway.
I think you did a great job covering the House procedure as a former House staffer myself. I will say I brought both very partisan and quite bipartisan bills through the Rules Committee this Congress, and it is no easy task, and often involves quite a bit of negotiation with people who often disagree quite a bit. I'll give one example here that I think is relevant and shows that it can be done. Is a bill like perhaps the FAA bill, which moved through the House with a really, really large bipartisan vote, the kinds of votes that we often see for a farm bill, but had a pretty precarious path through the Rules Committee. And I will admit, at many points, we thought we might not make it. So I think you guys both have a really good take on sort of the tough trajectory. And it's part of why we end up pushing these bills like this into those lame duck sessions where people have a little bit more freedom to do the work committee to committee, as opposed to needing to go through that really arduous process to get to the floor. Changing gears just a little bit, we talk about this a lot in the ag circles, but while we don't hear it all the time, the Farm Bill is really a climate bill. It provides billions of dollars annually to farmers, ranchers, and landowners to implement soil health practices that sequester carbon. We see investments in precision ag practices that improve production efficiency and reduce emissions across the board. What do you think are the high points in the sort of two competing packages on climate and conservation? Stacy, I'll start with you.
So I will start by saying, and you mentioned this, that the Farm Bill is really a climate bill. I don't know a single farmer that says, I want to use more water, spend more on fuel, and buy more fertilizer this year, right? So I've always said that our agricultural producers are the ultimate conservationists. They are always looking for programs that will make their production more efficient and more cost beneficial to them, which oftentimes means reducing input that would otherwise have a climate impact, right? And so I think that, there's been a lot of conversation about, do we cut conservation programs for stuff more on the sort of ag side, the ag production side of things? Do we cut all of this IRA funding completely to fund that kind of stuff? I think that in every framework that you have seen, whether it's Thompson's framework, whether it's Bozeman's framework, or Stabenow's framework, there's been a really significant nod toward conservation and how important it is, no matter what you call it, right? And I think it was really important that instead of taking that IRA money and putting it towards something else in the Farm Bill, it was sort of like reinvested in those conservation programs. And I think that's an important sort of thing that we need to kind of sometimes step back, whether or not we call it climate smart or conservation or whatever. It really all is the same thing, and helping our farmers meet what might be some pretty onerous state requirements that they have to live within, and also just to make their production more efficient at the end of the day. So there were big, I think, really important statements made toward conservation in all three of those frameworks.
I couldn't agree more. When we were talking before about a potential path forward for this legislation, and that's a great example. All of the 4 leaders of the agriculture committees have agreed to move the conservation money into the baseline and to keep it in conservation. Now, there's some debate over whether it continues to have the so-called climate guardrails and what you consider to be climate guardrails, for example. One of my longstanding clients is the Specialty Crop Farm Bill Alliance, and that's a national coalition of the fruit, vegetable, tree nut, and horticulture folks in the United States. It's what a lot of folks think of as being farm and food that actually isn't in a lot of the Farm Bill, to be candid with you. But from their perspective, climate is not just about fighting climate change. It's also about adaptation. There are a lot of growers that now live in regions where they didn't have drought before and they never needed to irrigate, but now they do. And so how do we do that responsibly? And is that a climate benefit that can somehow qualify for conservation money? I do think there's room in there for those discussions in the conservation title that requires the debate to get out of the press release stage and into the negotiating room stage, and they're just not there. I do also, when it comes to climate, again, slightly from the specialty crop perspective, there's a big issue about disaster programs and extreme weather and the ad hoc disaster program, the crop insurance. And does crop insurance work for everyone? Is that the right model, or should we be looking at a more Title I commodity payment model? And the last thing I'll mention that's somewhat tangentially related, but can be really important, and I actually think we're getting some traction on this issue in this particular Farm Bill debate. The adjusted gross income limitation for conservation programs boxes a lot of your bigger operations out, or even if they're not bigger, and this applies a lot to specialty crop growers, they may simply live in an area of the country and operate in the area of the country with an extremely high cost of living and extremely high input costs that you can't offset on your tax return until many years out. So you're just not allowed to participate in these programs. And a lot of those folks have just tossed their hands up and not engaged. If there's a way to be a bit more flexible and making sure that the money is actually going to farmers and is getting sent to its highest and best environmental use, I think that can make a big difference as well for the climate, whether it's considered climate guardrails or not.
I love two things. One, I love that you brought up specialty crops, having worked for a member from the Central Valley in California. I've spent quite a bit of time talking about that issue. And it's, I think, a perfect example of where we kind of forget a little bit about what these policies mean on a practical basis for the farmer. To Stacy's point, we say, do we label it as conservation or do we label it as a climate program? We often get caught up here, and like I like to think of it as like this beltway buzzword policy making approach, where we pick the thing we're going to talk about that Farm Bill cycle, and we talk about it a lot, but then we don't really think about what it means for the farmer. So we've seen, no-till, and then the Chesapeake Bay, and then pollinators and cover crops, and now we're calling it climate smart. And the problem with these kinds of phrases is that we often don't think about it, what it means in a practical way for that individual farmer. I love the example you used about adjusted gross income and how it could exclude, the sort of kinds of limits can exclude the farmers who are really trying to do these policies and procedures to put them in place so that they can actually have an impact. So how do we get ourselves past this sort of like catchphrase approach and build on those conservation policies that improve outcomes without threatening the farmers, ranchers, and landowners who we need to want to participate in these programs? Like, how do we sort of take them back a little bit to the field and figure out how to make things that really work? Stacy, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think you really hit on something that is important for us to talk about, and it's sort of like the language that we use when we create new programs, or how we create new programs, and sort of like what is bought into those programs. And I think it's a pretty difficult thing to move beyond in Washington, D.C. And I think this is an incredibly frustrating thing for farmers and agricultural producers that are like out in the U.S. and all they really want is help to address some sort of situation. And I think having a fulsome conversation in the Ag Committee, I think that's actually starting about, we need to move conservation practices forward. We need to help our farmers deal with a lot of times state regulations. You mentioned the Central Valley. California has a lot of state laws and rules and regulations that agriculture.
Far too many, in my opinion.
There's a lot, a lot of opinions. There's probably a lot of opinions about that, but yeah.
For sure.
And I know that, and I work with agricultural producers that work in California, especially crop producers, and they are heavily reliant right now on programs like Climate Smart and the conservation programs to help them with practices like whole orchard recycling or hedgerows, and some of these sort of like newer practices that these producers sort of need help with because they've got to reduce emissions. And, I think that the fact that we can bring it maybe back home to like what our producers are dealing with on a regular basis first, instead of just sort of like top cover. And a lot of this we're never going to get away from. We're never going to get away from how aggravated you are at the Secretary of Agriculture for using CCC funds for his priority. That is something that we are always going to fight about, regardless of the administration, regardless of the priority. And that's just the politics of it. But bringing that and making it a more local conversation about what producers need, I think is critically important.
Yeah, Stacy mentioned the Climate Smart commodities program that Secretary Vilsack rolled out a couple of years ago. it's gotten a lot of criticism, right, for quote, exceeding his authority. He didn't actually exceed his authority. The authority's there. It is there. It's there for a reason. One could have a debate about whether the Climate Smart Commodities Program and the size of it, or the Market Facilitation Program the Secretary released, and the size of that is within the spirit of what Congress meant for the CCC discretion. But I've worked in the Office of General Counsel at USDA, and I can tell you that discretion is there. While I'm on it, I know we're going to get to this eventually, Emily, but whether that should be restricted or not is another story. I do know a lot of agriculture groups, though, were privately very concerned about the notion of eliminating it altogether, because it is a flexible tool that can be used in times of emergency, or in other crisis situations, particularly when Congress is not able to act very quickly, which unfortunately has been the status quo for some time now.
I'll take that one. We deserve it.
Well, yeah, we've all worked there at a time when it was dysfunctional, so it's not just on you. So I think, though, when you're looking at the Climate Smart Commodity Program, specialty crops are in an odd spot when it comes to climate, because depending on what you grow, and this is always the problem with specialty crops, which Emily knows all too well. I know, Stacy, you have specialty crop clients too. If you're an orchard crop, you have certain challenges. If you're a crop that you are growing annually, or if you're growing in a region where you're growing year round versus seasonally, and you can have an early frost, the needs of each one of those crops is so dramatically different. And some climate practices just can't fit with the way specialty crops are grown in certain areas. So I'm very aware of some that loved the Climate Smart Commodity Program because it put cash in their pocket to do innovative things that they needed to do on their operations. And I know others that just haven't given it a second thought because they don't necessarily think it applies to them. That to me also ties back to the AGI issue. And I want to hit on it one more time, just because I was out in California about 3-4 weeks ago. And I met with a very large name brand California international operator. Everybody would know who it was if I said it. And they're self-funding some incredibly creative and innovative thing in the climate space for an industry where there isn't a lot of that work taking place, right? And I understand that they can afford to do it, but they could certainly afford to do a lot more. And if they have some lean years, they're not going to be able to afford to do it anymore. And their competitors certainly can't do it at all without the assistance. So unless we're able to figure out a way to make that work, I think that we're missing a lot of opportunities to make a real difference in folks' operations, which, as you said, spot on, Emily, this is what this is about. This is about real people that grow food that benefits everyone. You don't grow food in the grocery store.
So I want to take sort of something you said and build on that a little bit. Stacy mentioned this as well. We've seen before that when we give, we locally implement USDA programs, they tend to be more effective because we have such regional disparity and crop disparity, and specialty crops is a great example of that, where every crop is different, like you said. Also, we tend to see, frankly, we can all take some blame for this, that Congress is slow to do its job. Sometimes USDA is slow to do its job. And when we start to do things up at this sort of like macro federal level, it's hard to implement them in an effective way. Do we think that this sort of a heavier hand from Congress in the climate space threatens the viability of these programs long term? Does it make it too political? Does it make it hard to implement? Jonathan, I'll start with you on this one.
I'm taking a pause just to think about this for a bit. If I'm thinking about the local issues, which I think are critically important, again, talking our common ground on specialty crops here, we have a very successful program called the Specialty Crop Block Grant Initiative. And that is a state program where you get an allocation of money from the federal government based on the value of production of specialty crops in your state. It's administered by the State Department of Agriculture. If you ask members of the leadership of my coalition what they feel about the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, your answer you get is going to vary very widely based on what state they live in and what kind of relationship they have with their Department of Agriculture. So my one word of caution about the local bit of this is it depends how that's administered. And so one of the things we've done in our proposals is to try and find a way to elevate best practices to bring states where it's not working great up to the level that would be more beneficial to the growers without mucking it up for the states that already work well. So I think that will be a constant push-pull. I do agree with you. I think local, particularly with respect to agriculture, because you just think about the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill typically is not a partisan debate, typically a regional debate, right? So all of these issues are regional depending on the needs of what you grow, where you grow it, and what your weather's like. And so I think that is a very excellent observation. If there's a bit more local access, which I do think the conservation programs have a significant amount of discretion in, that's definitely helpful.
So I will follow on that and just say that, I traditionally do not like a sort of like top-down implementation. And I do understand Jonathan's point about the relationship with the state conservationists or their farm service agency director. The one thing I will tell you is that like they usually know who those people are. They usually have a relationship with those individuals. And, the water resources needs are vastly different in California than they are, say, in Mississippi. And there's some other challenge in Mississippi that they need to deal with, whether it's pest or some other conservation measure that they need to implement. And so I've always been a giant fan of localizing that, regionalizing that, making sure the state conservationists have as much flexibility as they possibly can to implement programs that are tailored to and meet the needs of their agricultural producers. I also feel like sometimes, an agricultural producer sees the greatest new idea from Washington and they're like, oh, here's another great idea from Washington that I'm going to be required to implement. And I don't think that always is the best delivery mechanism for probably a pretty fine idea, right? I think sometimes if they hear it from a more local source first, than hearing it from the government, they're willing to accept that information.
You're saying rural farmers don't trust the government all the time? That's
well, it's the whole, I'm from Washington and I'm here to help. I thought about leading with that, but I didn't want to upset Jonathan too much.
Just a good throwback to a classic line. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about another sort of climate-centric issue. We've heard a lot about carbon markets recently. Can either of you give us an update on USDA's activity in the voluntary carbon market space post the enactment of the Growing Climate Solutions Act? And then also, how would the House and Senate farm bills impact these markets one way or another?
I'll give kind of just a quick update on sort of like what USDA is doing, because they actually have a sort of comment period closing on Friday.
I was going to say, we're right in the thick of it right now, right?
Right in the thick of it. So, USDA has put out their request for information for their greenhouse gas and third-party verifier program, which will sort of be how USDA kind of manages this voluntary market on these carbon credits moving forward. And so lots of people are getting ready to put their comments in, including people that I work with. And so that's sort of like the first step and sort of the biggest program that USDA really has to implement to implement the, oh gosh, what's the bill? The Growing Climate Solutions Act. Is that right?
Yeah, you got it. Growing Climate Solutions. I talked about it way more than I would have liked when I was in the speaker's office.
Right, so that's like one of the first things that's happening on this. And I think that, if you're in a state that sort of requires this, like California, I think Tennessee may have some very interesting rules on this too. USDA put out a really big report, I think at the end of last year, about how this would work in the agricultural and forestry industries. And I think it's a place that if people are willing to do this sort of like voluntary system, then they're willing to kind of buy down these credits. And so I think it's kind of a new and burgeoning market in agriculture and forestry. And I look forward to really kind of seeing how it goes and where it takes off. And Jonathan, I don't know if you.
Yeah, no, I echo that. I think one of the key principles that folks need to be mindful of is making sure that the benefits ultimately go to the growers who are doing the practices and investing in these things. I think it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of USDA in this comment period. I know I have a couple of clients, one in particular is in the MRV space, how are we making sure, it's another big issue in this from a principles perspective, how are we making sure that these climate savings that are being paid for and traded are real, that they're value added and not simply moving digits around on ledgers and calling it a climate benefit. I think the other issue that frankly I just don't think we're ready for yet, but the private sector is asking for, is we need a more comprehensive approach to this, because you have the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. They're looking at sending guidance to the exchanges that they regulate, because they're starting to look at products that deal with trading derivatives and its other things of that nature relating to climate credits. So I think the world is, maybe ultimately it requires some sort of international framework as at least a floor or baseline. But we need standards, and we need them in a way that are going to make sure that the benefits are real and that the economic benefits accrue at least proportionally to the people that are doing the real work, and not a bunch of landowners on Wall Street or something of that sort.
Yeah, I think you raise a great point about building a verifiable system that really benefits those farmers and the growers who are doing the real work. But also, I think the challenge we run into is that these voluntary markets, we want to build them in a way that doesn't appear to be a backdoor into the regulatory space. I think farmers are rightfully concerned about that sort of thing. And we've got a question in the chat that I want to jump to, because it ties in really well here. It's regulations, state and federal, are really pushing our value chains to disclose more and more on greenhouse gas emissions, and pushing farmers to share more farm data or change their on-farm operations. Do either of you foresee efforts to more support farmers in complying with those sort of state regulations? I think the federal regulations are a little bit TBD, because we aren't quite sure how the SEC stuff is going to play out. But do we think we're going to see those incorporated in the Farm Bill, or are we just going to see kind of folks pushing back against regulations like that to protect farmers?
I'm going to jump in real quick with one edit, and it's a trend that I'm seeing more and more happening. And I saw it big time when I was out in California a few weeks ago, meeting with a variety of different growers. And that, at least for me, I was hearing more concern about the standards, the demands, and the specs that are coming from retailers that have increasing market share and are putting requirements on their growers than they were complaining about the EPA or the USDA or their state regulator. It was a noted shift for me. So I think that's another piece of this puzzle that we should not miss, is consumer demand is driving retailers to push folks from the private sector perspective too. So I do think that there's a space here where we need to find a way to help growers with compliance more.
Yeah, I will follow in on that, because this has been sort of brewing out there for a while, like requirements from sort of corporate America on products that they buy for their supply chains. And, I think this really gets back to a lot of the vacuum in leadership that we actually see in Washington from our inability to get things done. When there's a vacuum in leadership, people pick up that leadership and they run with the ball. And that usually ends up being state governments, sort of corporate requirements on their supply chain. And I think that, the federal government could lead, not with mandates, but with supporting tools to help sort of like meet this kind of requirements, right? I mean, regardless of where you are growing, you probably have some requirement from a local entity, a water district, any number of overlapping government entities that you have to abide by their rules. And to the extent that the federal government can provide you with the tools to meet those requirements, I think all the better. Right. Like I've never been opposed to the federal government providing individuals with the tools to meet certain requirements. And, Jonathan's point about corporate America, I think we're going to see a lot more of that, because it's become an advertising tool, particularly in labeling with things like sustainably raised, or any number of labels that you'll see on food packaging that become a marketing tool for their products. I think you'll continue to see a lot more of that.
Do we think that the kind of the growing, net zero commitments that we see from industry help move this support in the right direction, or is that just like totally divorced from the kinds of programs we see supporting producers?
Do you think it's kind of like a bottom up approach?
Right.
Yeah,
Like, do we think those pledges are pulling programs in one direction or another, or are we in a position where we're going to make a lot of promises we can't keep and then come back to the Farm Bill for help?
Oh, no, we're going to do that for sure, no matter what the topic is. We're absolutely going to make more promises than we can keep. But no, I mean, this gets back, I think, to one of the things I said earlier is I don't know a single farmer that really wants to, spend more on water or fuel or fertilizer or pollute more because, their soil is the most important, asset that they have. Right. And so I think that there are a lot of people out there, if given the right tools and the right environment, want to be net zero. Right. And I don't think that's a bad thing to talk about. I think that you'll find that a lot of producers are really interested in leaving as little trace as possible, from year to year over the decades and, really sort of like reconditioning their soil and making it better. And we've seen this throughout time as we've gone through conservation practices with, rotation of crops, with doing cover crops, with doing no-till. And we talk about all of these things that have come out over the years, but, they are leading to a more environmentally healthy practice by most of our agricultural producers. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that's really kind of where they want to be at the end of the day.
I might take us in a slightly different direction, if that's okay, and talk a little bit about energy in rural communities, because I do think another factor that's out there, and it's a big chunk of money in well, it's not in the Farm Bill, to be clear, but it was in the IRA, and there was some debate about whether it should come out of the IRA by the Farm Bill. And it's a lot of money for the rural utility service, because there are times when economic situations, including well-intentioned government intervention dating back to the Great Depression, had economic incentives that had rural communities heavily indebted and continuing to operate coal-fired power plants, and their community didn't want it, right? But it was too expensive for them to get out of those loans and move forward and transition into really once-in-a-generation opportunity to move to cleaner energy production. I was with a producer recently, actually two different producers, and they're related. It's kind of funny. One was in New York, one was in California, and one invested heavily in solar panels on his operation and said, given the cost of energy and his inputs, that he almost wished he could start harvesting the sun instead of harvesting his crops. And then another is like, no, we've never really thought about it. I wouldn't bother with that. But it is another component to all of this. The energy costs are really significant, not only for producers, but also rural communities and the distribution of agricultural commodities.
Yeah, I think that's the thing we often forget is that, energy is the largest input cost for a farmer. And it often drives both their emissions and their costs up. Energy is related to everything that they care about, right? Like, how do you operate your farm? How do you get fertilizer? How do you make sure you can balance your checkbook at the end of the day? And those issues are way more connected than people think. We often put the Farm Bill in one category and energy in another. But I think that really ties back to the question we had about the regulatory side, which is, how does the regulatory environment increase those costs or bring them down so that farmers can afford to do some things that are perhaps a little bit more environmentally responsible? Okay, so I'm going to shift gears to my favorite topic now, but I waited all the way until the end of the webinar to do it, which is to talk about forest management. What are the things we've seen in the House and Senate bills that address our forests and how we particularly deal with our wildfire challenges in the West, which we all know are a huge driver of our particularly emissions in California, but in the West writ large and globally. So what have we got in these bills, y'all?
Okay, so I think Jonathan and I will be the first to tell you that we are not the biggest experts on forestry.
I appreciate you doing your homework, though. It's so fun.
My mom lives right off the Ouachita National Forest, and I had to deal with the Mark Twain National Forest for a long time. And so I think, and Republicans and Democrats like to talk about this a little bit differently. And this was a big push during the last administration at USDA and sort of like the active management of the forest. and that we need to manage forests so that there are, less risk of forest fires, and that includes the fact that we have to clear trees, we have to do control burns, we have to manage a forest so that it remains healthy and also becomes less of a risk. So, and it's hard to tell from the Senate frameworks really sort of like what they're thinking in this space. But if you read the Senate frameworks, they both mention better forest management, right? The Stabenow framework does, and the Bozeman framework do. And so you can tell that they're sort of thinking about this, and they should be thinking about it, because it's a huge problem that we have, particularly in the West. And it's something that's actually incredibly expensive, not just for the Forest Service to fight fires, but for homeowners who have lost their homes, for entire communities that have lost their community. I mean, Emily, you mentioned, Central Valley in California. I mean, that's an annual threat for them. And so they have done some things, and, I don't explain these well, but the categorical exclusions, they've expanded those so that there are some things that the Forest Service sort of says you can do without having to go through, say, a full NEPA process. So you can remove diseased trees, you can do all of these other things. And so I think that particularly with the House Farm Bill, we have more of a sense of where they're headed. They are moving in that direction, sort of to give the Forest Service the ability to manage these forests on a more active basis without having to go through as many hurdles as they would traditionally have to go through on the environmental side.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add because I know just enough to be horribly dangerous on this topic. But I agree. I think the premise really is the cost of dealing with this after the fact is far worse, both in human capital and in money. One personal story, I know when I was still my brief time at USDA OGC, the Department of Agriculture was having to, because they didn't have the financial resources to cover their fire costs. Were suing electric utilities, claiming that they were liable for starting the fire because of poor maintenance of their utility lines. And it's won huge amounts of money. And I think we may have seen at least one utility go bankrupt over that. So, the cost is significant in two places where you might not even think of it. And it is definitely an issue that has to be addressed, I think, for long-term sustainability. But I'm sorry, Emily, I wasn't able to do as much homework this weekend as I had hoped.
No, y'all did a great job. I will say, and Stacy gave me an opportunity to jump to my other favorite topic, which is NEPA reform, and whether or not we get to expand a little bit. We've seen a lot more sort of bipartisan support for the use of these categorical exclusions to help us better manage forest land. I think we're seeing it in the energy space too. Do you think that we'll see some permitting and forest management policies, like say the Save Our Sequoias Act that was included in the House bill? Do we think we'll see some of those things make it into the final bill? Will this sort of like broader permitting reform push give us a little bit of, will we get a teaser in the Farm Bill when we finally land this thing?
I'll start with just a touch on the permitting reform issue. Going back to the Rural Utility Service and these new loan programs for converting coal to solar, and also the PACE program, which just supports new renewable energy projects. A lot of environmentalists, diehard ones, have looked at that issue and realized that a serious obstacle to getting that money out the door and into communities in a timely manner, because you could have the biggest, most robust, most beautiful, most perfect loan and grant program to put solar power and wind power in rural communities, but if the private sector doesn't want to bother with your money because the process is just too darn painful, they're not going to. So that's just one example I'm closer to. I have to imagine the same applies over on the other side, that I think there's a desire brewing for some common sense action on permitting reform. Plus, when you look also again at the electric utility side, citing new distribution, and again with renewable energy, that's a big piece of that too, and that's another major holdup that you're going to have in getting that deployed.
Yeah, I will follow on that and say, we see that a lot too, that people will just say, I don't really want to fool with this federal money because I don't want to have to go through this process. We can find you the perfect program, but if you won't apply for it because it's too onerous, then that's money left on the table. And that's also maybe some advances that you won't be doing for your company or your, stakeholders. And we see permitting reform come up quite regularly. I think the closest we were to it was with the CHIPS and Science Act when we were like this close, and Emily was probably closer to this than I was for sure, on some sort of permitting reform. And, in typical Washington, D.C. fashion, that sort of fell apart because it wasn't comprehensive permitting. And, I think that I worry we could fall into that trap over and over again if we're not careful, trying to make, you make the perfect the enemy of the good. And while I would love to see comprehensive NEPA and permitting reform, not saying that we don't have to have permitting or NEPA, but that it needs to be more streamlined and almost basically one application. And this is something you hear over and over again. I think that there are a lot of people out there that would say, yes, this process needs to be reformed. I think we will get very hung up on how and whether or not it is comprehensive enough.
Yeah, I can say as the House staffer who led a lot of the permitting reform negotiations, including the ones for the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it's a frustrating place to work. But part of why I bring it up in the context of the Farm Bill is that I think, the way that we solve these issues is to get more of our stakeholders at the table at the same time, instead of talking in our echo chambers a little bit. Like to Jonathan's point, the rural energy issue is just as relevant for a farmer as, how do we get through the permitting process for a Western water project. Also, I want a little credit that I didn't make people talk about California water on this webinar, so you're welcome. Okay, so we're getting near the end of our time, so I want to kind of take it back to our big top issue here, which is our IRA money. We've touched on it a little bit. We've got our different approaches in this, the Senate and the House, and between Senator Stabenow and Chairman Thompson. I obviously lean a little heavier towards the House approach and think they kind of thread the needle on this thing, but we obviously have a long way to go before we meet in the middle. What do you both think about, one, about the House approach and the Senate approach, and two, if we're going to be able to land a broader bipartisan compromise to move this forward? Stacy, I'll start with you.
So I too like the House approach for just kind of a couple of reasons. One being sort of procedural, in that it kind of brings that conversation back into the committee structure where it, in my opinion, it should have been in the first place, versus the IRA process, which was obviously negotiated with the committee, but with one side of that committee. And so this sort of brings it back in. And then it also sort of like dumps money back into these conservation programs for the future. And I like that component of it. I think that the Farm Bill should be the place where agricultural conservation programs are discussed, where they are funded, where they are negotiated. And so I appreciate that approach. The IRA programs that exist, I know lots of clients and friends out there that have been using those programs. They like those programs. I think this brings the conversation back to a more fulsome place where we're talking to both sides about how these programs should work. And they also put them back into sort of like permanently authorized programs and changed a handful of the parameters. And that's just what you do in a Farm Bill every 5 years, sometimes 6. But that's what you do every 5 years in a Farm Bill. And I think that's a healthy discussion. And I'm glad personally that they've sort of like brought that back into the Farm Bill discussion.
I like your comment about sometimes 6. My first Farm Bill was the 2012, 2013. No, actually 2014 Farm Bill. Yes.
Yeah, I have both. I was around for 2008, and then I have 2012 and 2014 here.
I was going to say, shout out to my former boss, Chairman Frank Lucas, for getting us across the finish line, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But, I think where I'm going to take this part of the conversation is just where you brought it, Emily. It was Frank Lucas, Debbie Stabenow, Pat Roberts, Thad Cochran. There are different mixes in there. Colin Peterson. I'm speaking very personally, not from any perspective of any of my clients, just my own gut on this. I think on an issue like this, there is very clearly a path forward. And I think it's one in which you're not going to get just the House approach, and you're not going to just get the Senate approach. There's got to be a conversation that has where one side sits across from the other and says, okay, I hear and I'll be really practical and pragmatic about this. It doesn't even have to be philosophical. It could be, I hear you need the climate stuff in there in some way or form or fashion, or you're going to lose votes. Right? You got to pass the bill, and it requires votes to pass the bill. And each one of these negotiators know where their votes are and where they're going to lose them. And I think similarly on the other side, there's got to be more flexibility. Okay, well, how do we loosen or redefine or change what that climate thing is, or what else can we call it, or maybe a subset of the program, so that I can bring some of my votes over and we can move the bill forward. I think the thrifty food plan issue is a bit thornier, just because it's so emotional. But in the 2014 Farm Bill, there were significant changes made to SNAP that some people called a cut. And it got moved forward and was defended by the negotiators because they believed in the overall package of what they were doing. And I think at the end of the day, that's what this is really about. They need to come together with a will to figure out what is our path forward. I'm not going to win everything I want, but we're all better off if we get this into law. And truly looking at these different frameworks, I don't know what you think, Stacy and Emily, but I'm curious. I'm going to ask you. I'll turn the tables on you, Emily. I'm going to ask you. It doesn't strike me that the frameworks, maybe put aside certain dollar amounts, they're not terribly far apart, which is frustrating.
I would agree with you. I think, we see a lot, and it's a blessing and a curse, right? As you mentioned, ag, the Farm Bill it's a regional bill with regional differences, far more regional differences than there are partisan differences. That works to our benefit in that we end up with talking points that sound pretty similar depending on what type of part of the country you're from. But it can work to our disadvantage where I think we use a lot of the same language, and it's not quite as clear where those real policy differences are on the surface for regular people who might be tuned into this webinar. I think, that's part of where I think, frankly, the work that we're all trying to do with the Climate24 series really comes in as how do we sort of parse out what are those real policy differences, and then also how do we deal with, how do we look at those political challenges like, hey, to your point, we're going to have to sit across the table from each other and talk about a real vote counting exercise to get this done, because it's not something that's just going to be all the Republicans on one side and all the Democrats on the other. In order to get it done, and the reality is that it's much more politically possible after the election than it is before the election, and it's part of why we wanted to do this series going into the fall as opposed to rushing to get all of it done in November, because there's going to be a lot of issues that are like this that are a little bit easier to sit down at the negotiating table for post-election. Stacy, what did I miss?
No, I think you get it all. I think the one thing too, though, is that, and Jonathan mentioned it, is this issue with Thrifty and how they pay for all of these programs. I mean, all of the frameworks have made a lot of promises, and ultimately there's got to be some money there to fulfill those promises. And Jonathan worked on the 2014, 2012 Farm Bill. And Jonathan, do you remember off the top of your head how much money you cut?
$23 billion.
That's right.
Ooh, buddy.
So that was I was on the 2014 Farm Bill too. So
fiscal conservatives, look at you guys go.
Yeah, but they $20 billion and they were very wedded to that number, but the baseline made that possible. And, like I said earlier, CBO is not always our friend. And so I think it's going to be difficult to achieve a lot of the goals that have been laid out there with the current structure.
Yeah, 2014.
CBO is always I was going to say CBO is the dark horse in every Farm Bill negotiation, right?
Don't ever ask me to explain CBO. I can occasionally explain appropriations, but I will always defer to Stacy on that. No, just a little bit of flashback here. 2012 Farm Bill debate started during the super committee deficit reduction effort. And that's where they came up with a $23 billion cut because they thought it was their, quote, fair share of the federal spending. And it stuck through the whole process. And the leaders had to sit down and decide how much that 23 billion comes out of which title, and then move on from there. And those conversations just aren't happening, at least as far as I can tell right now, in that same way.
Yep, I would agree. I think that's one of the things that's been missing in this whole process is real four corners leadership engagement. Because in my experience, having been a committee staffer and a leadership staffer, you can't get the committees to sit down in the room and really get into the details until leadership all agrees that they have to. And I think we'll need to see a real push from Leader Schumer and Speaker Johnson to say, hey, we've got to start having these negotiations at the committee level so we can actually get text we can all agree to. Well, we are over hitting our time just now, so I apologize. We're having so much fun talking about the Farm Bill. We could go on for another hour. We've covered all our questions, but if you'd like to discuss anything further with me or with our experts here on this call, you can reach out to our team at electionimpacts2024@boundarystone.com. I want to give a big thank you to our speakers, Stacy McBride and Jonathan Cordone, for sharing their incredible expertise and experience. And thank all of our attendees for joining us today. We will be continuing our Climate24 webinar series, so stay tuned for upcoming events on topics spanning climate, politics, and beyond. And have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.